All right, folks, good afternoon. I hope you're all well. I hope those of you that have moved back in and are here in Boone, I hope you had a safe trip. And of course, Boone welcomes you by bringing us a few inches of snow. Um, and hopefully you didn't slip or anything like that on the way in. So wanted to go over just some basics for the next couple of weeks before we go on and finish with chapter two. So let's see, where is I? Um, I wanted to first give you an idea when we're going to return, excuse me, to the face-to-face classrooms. So I think it would be a little wonky if we tried to go back to classes right now, right, right in the middle. Oops, excuse me, that's the wrong one. Let me get to your class. I had the wrong one up, but I can do this. Okay. So we will be returning back to face-to-face classes, and we will do that after the Valentine's Day. Okay. And so our first day back that we will actually do face-to-face classroom will be February 16th. Okay. So next week, after you take the test, February 9th, we will still do it online as we're doing it now. And then for the February 11th class, I will be making a recording. My father is under a doctor's care right now. And so once a month, I go to visit him to see how he's doing. And so on the 11th, you will find a recording to cover that particular class in Channel Power. Then February 16th, we'll be back in the classroom. The class is going to be at if you haven't been in Peacock Hall, it's on the fourth floor, and it's in what's called the Holland Fellows Room. Now they've set up the Holland Fellow Room. It's a big room, and they've set it up so that there is more than enough seating for everyone. And they have one gigantic television in there and another one as a second monitor. And so there'll be plenty enough space for everyone, and with sufficient care about distancing requirements. So I will also, of course, be doing live Zoom meetings. And yes, I will still record. I would urge you, if you can, and I mean, I urge you to, you know, with all that I can, even though I am giving the options of recording, is that it is much more valuable to you to be able to be here live like you are now instead of the recordings. You could, in the last semester, I could find almost just perfect gaps between those students who came face to face, those students who watched live, and those who watched the recordings. I mean, there was very little differences between the students who were there face to face and those that were, live on Zoom, but there was a significant difference on those who, watched the recordings. It's just, I don't know whether it's catch 22 or not. I don't know whether it's the chicken or the egg, or whether or not you're always being there live signifies that you're more dedicated, or is it because you're more dedicated you're always going to watch it live? I don't know. All I can only tell you is that the grades are better, and I would hope, without insisting, that you would be able to join me live. Now, for those of you who wish to come face to face, many of you have had the issue and has spoken to our chair of our department. And so the university is certainly aware that some of you will have online classes, and immediately in the next section, you're going to have face-to-face. And just the mere physics of having to sit in your dorm room and then race like crazy to get across, across campus would be difficult. What we're going to do is that in every building in Peacock Hall, there will be one classroom that'll be designated for students who are doing an online course. And so what you could do is that if you had to have my class before a class or after a class, you could go to this one room, and I will email you when I know which one it is. But you can go there, bring your laptops, bring your headphones. You could participate in the class. Once the class is over, of course, you could pack things up and come to my class or whichever one it is. So they are making allowances for that. And of course, those of you, if it's an online class before, then certainly join us online afterwards. Okay. So there are many ways that we will hopefully have this adjusted. Now, the test is going to be on, it will be on Thursday. But I failed to mention is that the test actually will be Thursday and Friday. So in that 2-day span between, 12:01 Thursday morning till Friday night at midnight, you have the opportunity of taking the test. I will do my very best to have grades finished by Saturday night. If nothing comes up, hopefully they shouldn't, okay? So as I've talked about, the students have asked me, any tips on the test. If there are any sessions that you've missed, if you haven't been able to be live on any of them, I urge you to go watch the recordings of those, because the recordings, everything that I've talked about in class is the possibility of being on the test, but nothing that I haven't talked about won't be on the test. In other words, if you're in the book and it's something there or an extra slide, and I haven't covered that slide, rest assured, you're not going to see it on the test. Students ask me what's the best way to study for that. The multiple choice questions, you'll see 2 or 3 different types. And so just to give you an idea, you might have a multiple choice question that would be just a basic definition one, like postponement is the willingness to put off the purchase of an item. That would be an example of just a basic definition question. You might also get a reflected learning question, which would be, the example would be, Bill has decided that he is not going to go watch a movie at the local theater with the hope that it'll come out on one of his streaming services. This is an example of postponement, all right? And so you'll see questions in either kind of way that they work. The system is set up so that they randomize the questions, and so there's no first multiple guess and then essay. They'll be all mixed together. No one's test is going to look exactly like this, like another one. So they're just going to be constantly randomized. If they are essay questions, one of the students in the other class asked me for how much should you write? And I'm certainly not asking you to write the Bible, all right? If it's easier for you to do it in a listing way, in other words, to do bullet points, then certainly that would be enough, as long as you cover the pertinent things, all right? I mean, as long as you hit the essential things. And as I said before, please, one of the things that I ask you to do is that don't leave any of the essays questions blank, okay? Okay, well, let's go right on. I've done enough talking, and let's go ahead and finish this chapter. So we had moved through and talked about the template, the efficiency template, and we talked about its purposes. And ultimately, we were ending with a discussion of the equity principle. And so we talked about the equity principle, and what it basically means is an honest day's wage for an honest day's work. And the equity principle says is that the level of compensation for anyone in the channel system should reflect the participation and value that they bring that's created by that participation. And so what it means is that the compensation should mirror what the efficiency template tells you, the normative profit shares. And we talked about that as being the shares that an individual should get. Well, why? Well, it's appropriate to reward each member in accordance with the value that they create. It creates an incentive for channel members to want to continue to generate value. All of you have been in groups where you feel like you may have contributed more than the others, and yet your grade is no more than any single member is in your groups. I also understand that, by the way, and in your group work, I will send a survey out so that you can audit your own channel or your own group members. It also is important that you really should identify the actual costs as they occur so that you can develop an acceptable estimate of the value that you create. And then the unfortunate thing is, the truth is that many times actual profit shares don't match the normative share that's suggested. And ultimately, those are the reasons why that conflict eventually builds in any system. Okay. Now, one of the main purposes for this is that what you're trying to do is you're trying to build towards what's known as a zero-based channel concept, which means that the compensation and value created is equal to all of the parts together. So the zero-based channel, you start from scratch. In other words, you start from the very beginning and you build together the pieces that the channel functions that ultimately are performed and how they go about creating overall value. The zero-based channel also is the idea that you can build these functions together to create an overall value with the minimum cost possible. And the zero-based channel basically says is that you're going to do all of this and it's not going to cost you anything. The truth is, of course, is that what it means is at a minimum cost, because the zero-based channel, it may not even exist. It doesn't exist. I mean, there's no way, or generally in any complex system, to be able to build a system that costs nothing at all. Okay. So why do you want to do this and build towards a zero-based channel where you start out from scratch and you add the requirements as you go along? Well, one of the reasons is that you try to find out what functions can be eliminated without damaging customer overall value or the channel satisfaction. You also try to find out if there's any redundant activities. Is there anything that could be eliminated that would lower the cost for the entire system? And then is there any way to eliminate or combine tasks to minimize the steps that reduce the cycle time and ultimately deliver a greater value with not so many steps? And then is it possible to automate those activities where they don't require you to constantly increase costs? Excuse me. Now, the redundant activities, especially those that are constantly done over and over again, are one of the biggest places where you can have too much cost. I often talk about personal selling. Personal selling is the most expensive thing in integrated marketing communications, but it's also one of the most valuable things as well. And of course, salespeople believe that marketing works for them, and marketing people believe that salespeople work for them, and it's an eternal triangle. But what it basically says is this: is where the salesman isn't needed, you want to eliminate that. All right. And then finally, are there any opportunities to modify information systems to help reduce those costs? Okay. I don't know if any of you have gotten into finance or accounting yet, there's a concept known as zero-based budgeting. And what zero-based budgeting says is that every day, let's see. Oh, excuse me. Can Eric asked me, can all of you see the PowerPoints right now? Is any of you don't see it right now? Excuse me. Let me go back on the PowerPoints. I apologize. Thank you, Eric, for pointing that out to me. Let me go to the PowerPoints again. Thank you, Eric. Okay, so let me just go back through those again. I talked about the equity principle, that a level of compensation should reflect the degree of participation with the channel functions. The purpose of the equity principle is to reward each channel member in accordance with the value that they create, because the equity principle basically says is that if we're being compensated for the value that we bring, we will create incentive for channel members to continue, all right? As I've said before, the actual shares don't match generally the normative profit shares, and that's one of the difficult things in any system, is it quite simply, it doesn't always match, or in most places it usually doesn't. However, one of the things that the efficiency template does do is it captures that information accurately that can be used later for negotiation, okay? So, as I talked about the zero-based channel, if any of you have had any accounting, you've heard of the concept of zero-based budgeting. So every year, every year for every corporation, companies that do zero-based budgeting, they literally start from scratch. And so it is like their company doesn't even exist, and they have to put together a portfolio or the goods that are needed in order for them to be able to produce. In 1976, President Carter, when he came in, installed zero-based budgeting. It lasted 2 years, unfortunately. And quite simply, not just for the difficulty of working with zero-based budgeting, the need to be able to justify every cost, but quite simply the complexity of the United States budget, which is enormous, that runs 4,000 pages long. Zero-based budgeting, it just wasn't feasible. Zero-based channel concept basically means is that you're going to build the important things in the service functions or the channel functions that you want to do to create value for the customer, but you want to do it in as low a possible cost as you can. All right. So whenever we're trying to put together a value proposition for our consumers, one of the things that is very easy for us to do is to quite simply not audit the customer and know what they believe is valuable, all right? Very often, we will not match the service outputs that are demanded by consumers, okay? And the reason why is that the management hasn't thought about it carefully enough, about targeting the demands of the end users, or about how do you go about managing the cost of running the channel. And the difficulty is quite simply, is that consumers have desires and needs that they wish to have fulfilled, and management, unfortunately, is just not listening, all right? So what do? You pay attention to both service gaps and cost gaps when you look and discuss about the channels, all right? And the truth is that gaps can arise even on the most of intentions from channel members, all right? So along with the basic gaps, we also have limitations that come about when we're trying to analyze, and these limitations can be both environmental and managerial. These are things, unfortunately, that get in the way of us being able to analyze of the channels efficiently. And so the first one is what's known as environmental bounds. And these are characteristics of the marketplace that are external to the whole channel environment that we do not have any particular control over. And so examples are legal conditions in the marketplace, which shape the way the channel partners work. You know, you can't simply stop a company from coming into the market if they want to, no matter what corporations might want to do. And the difficulty also with that is that the buy-in cost to get into into some businesses is quite simply too high. To to have another cell phone carrier out there would be an example of an environmental difficulty. It's just beyond the reach of many organizations to build it from scratch. I know in terms of legal conditions, before France was a member of the European Union, they didn't have tariffs on the goods that came in, tariffs, excuse me. But what they would have is that your goods would be shipped into France. This was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, early 80s. They would just allow them to sit in customs for 10 months. And so no matter what or how you brought in goods, those goods would just simply sit until, they would release them. And so that's an example of environmental bounds. A managerial bound is a rule or a difficulty that is imposed by the company itself. It may be a rule that's imposed by the company that they might do, like simply a desire to control customer activities in one way or another. And what that does is that it limits their ability to reach into other areas. Okay. Um, it can also reflect a lack of knowledge about what it takes to satisfy certain consumers. So, an example of a managerial bound that is an example. True story. In 2008, 2009, when the iPad came out, the iPad immediately had a lot of copycats, and they were mostly Android tablets. And they weren't bad. I mean, they ran the Android operating system. Of course, the screens were not as beautiful as an iPad screen is, and I'm one of those firm believers. It's one of the most brilliant screens ever made. Well, one of these corporations did not like the number of returns that we're getting, consumers just sending them back after, and within in the United States, you can return anything within 30 days except software, and you must get a return. Well, they decided that they were going to impose a rule that said that they would only accept returns if the tablets were broken or damaged in one way or another. So, folks, guess what consumers did? Anybody want to guess?
They smashed their tablets.
Yes, exactly. They broke the tablets. If that's the rule that they had to do, then sure, they went along with it. So, they went from 5% returns with damage to 100% returns with damage. And sometimes, people or managers outsmart themselves. Scott Adams, who does the Dilbert comics, he actually was an AT&T computer engineer, and most of the studies when he started Dilbert in the 70s and 80s, a lot of that stuff from things that he just worked around. And so one of his favorite stories is that in the 80s, I believe it was late 80s, AT&T wanted all of their engineers, their system engineers, to have a laptop. But they were concerned with theft. And so what they did was they sent a rule around the offices saying that all of the laptops must be chained to their desks. So that's a true story. So there's an example of, no, I don't know, dumbness on parade. Anyway, So these are environmental and managerial limitations when it comes to satisfying the servicing gaps. So what kind of gaps are they? This is kind of a nice little handy dandy kind of cheat sheet for you. And you're not going to have to you're not going to have to memorize this. It's good, valuable information. I would use this as a way of studying. And so it talks about the two types of gaps: the service gaps, where SD means service demanded, is greater than SS, service supplied. And another gap is when the service supplied is greater than the service demanded. If there's no service gap, that's called a zero gap. Now, they also have what are called cost gaps as well, and we'll talk about those. But let's move on and talk about a service gap. Service gaps are two ways. A service gap exists if the amount of service supplied is less than the service that consumers demand, or if the amount of service supplied is greater than the amount that consumers demand. And so, in order to kind of enlighten you on what those are, let me kind of show you an example, and we'll talk about both. All right. Let's see if I've got the right one here. Let's see. No, of course not. Let's see. Okay. 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 I guess I had the wrong screen up. That's all right. I can work with this one. Okay. Excuse me. All right. If any of you have never seen this, this is known as a 45. And they call that a 45 because it goes on a record player 45 revolutions per minute. And so when singles were played on radio stations, what they would do is the publicists would send these 45s, and this 45 contained one song, all right? And this one song had a side A and it had a side B. So generally it would also tell you time, 3 minutes and 30 seconds. That's how long the record is. The single tells you who are the artists who wrote it. And believe it or not, they also had a side B on it as well. So there was actually another song on the other side, and there's a whole history of side B top singles, just by sheer accident. Okay. So anyway, 45s allowed you to be able to stack all of your favorite records and play one song at a time. All right. You see this little spindle thingy here, this red thing. It would fit in the middle here, and it would fit on the spindle of a record player. And you could take a bunch of these 45s and you could stack them like 10, 12 at a time, and you could play singles one after. In essence, you would create your own party tape with just singles. So technology moving on, in the 70s and 80s, you started to see compact discs. Now, compact discs were, let me think of the word I want to say. They were better, they were more dependable than vinyl records, because unfortunately vinyl records were, every time that you put a needle on a vinyl record, it's like an old friend of mine used to say, it's like plowing a furrow. However, there's nothing that beats the acoustic quality of a vinyl record. It's recorded in analog versus digital, so you get the whole spectrum. Anyway, the difficulty, however, with compact disc is that you would have one entire album and you couldn't have singles. And so what you found is that people were buying compact discs and they were also getting cassette tapes, and they were making their own party mixes. Okay. And so this is, an example. So you would take your CDs, you'd pull one or two off at a time, and you'd make your own tape. But the difficulty with that is that it still didn't satisfy the consumer demand to be able to buy one at a time. And it made consumers very frustrated. Well, in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, digital format had already been, in essence, understood. They knew how to do it. But it wasn't until there was a medium such as the internet to be able to distribute that we actually had a way of moving singles back and forth. And this is when we had the magic of this little corporation that was known as Napster. And so the way Napster worked is you used to have an old dial-up connection, and in the dial-up connection, what would happen is that you would have a few dozen songs. You use your dial-up internet connection, you'd connect, and you would request all of these songs on a bunch of servers that were all connected together with Napster. And so the way it worked is this: is you dialed into your local provider, you with the Napster interface, you'd all go to the Napster servers. The Napster servers knew what was on each individual's machine. So like the songs that were on your machine, they would be available for others and vice versa. And so you'd line up all of the things that you want to download. And so this tells you their connection speeds. So cable modems, 14.4 modem, and you just let it sit there and run for a couple of days, and it would download all the songs for you. So you'd have those things you're downloading and those things that you're uploading. Okay. Hold on one second, folks. I've got to answer a question. Hold on. All righty. Thank you. So this is an example of a service demanded that was greater than the service supplied. The consumers wanted to be able to have singles, but unfortunately, they had no way of doing it. So, what consumers do, they created their own way of getting it done. And if they would have been close enough to understanding this, then perhaps the entertainment medium or corporations would not have had some of the disasters that they had. All right. So service supplied was less than the service demanded. Okay. So the next thing is where the service supplied is greater than the service demanded. And so an example of this would be record stores. In the record stores after you started seeing digital downloads. All right, record stores. If you've never been in them, they literally that you'd have 1,000 records at any one time, and you could listen to an example of a song off of the records. They sold other things, of course. They were also head shops. They had blacklight posters, those kind of things. But basically, it was more than consumers wanted. And so this was an example of that. Okay. And so with too much service for what they wanted, it ultimately it failed. Okay. And so service gaps greater than you needed. Okay. So in kind of bringing everything together, businesses have to worry about not only their own service outputs, but also other businesses are better. And when one business does better and it charges a higher price, then what will happen is that consumers will flock to it even with a higher price. But if the businesses offer poor services, those prices tend to be lower. Um, when I was running my ISP, one of the things is I had a hotel who wanted to hook up a um, a room with internet, or let's just say the business kind of location with internet on the first floor, and I did that. And they were asking me if they could do internet access for everybody in the hotel, and they were going to charge extra. And my response with that is, sure, you can do it, and this is how you do it. And I said, but don't expect the advantage to stay forever. And quite simply, what happens is, in this, is that the service supplied, in terms of the service that's demanded, one of the things is that eventually consumers would want that same service, but with little or no cost at all. Okay. So the other part of that is to go along, it's possible to find service gaps in more than one service output. There can be several. And what you try to do with segmentation is try to identify which gaps exist for which cluster of potential buyers. And so for those consumers who like songs or singles, it created a gap that the whole record industry kind of ignored to their own peril. Now, cost gaps occur when the total cost of performing all the channel functions is simply too high. All right. In quite simply, to try to do all the functions that you need, it's just too expensive for consumers to accept. Okay. And when that happens, the gap will resort where channel members will shift to find those service outputs that are equal but cost less. Okay, so a great example of this is I'm going to go back to not just the record industry, but I want to talk about the entertainment industry, and I'm going to talk about one of those unique things out there, which is Blockbuster. Okay. So Blockbuster is a video store, or there's actually only one left. And what Blockbuster was a place where you could go rent rent videotapes and then ultimately rent DVDs. And so the way it used to work is like on a Friday afternoon at like 5 o'clock, people would come in just as they're going home. There would be like 24 of the latest movie, and there's like thousands of movies in a local Blockbuster. So consumers would pick up that disc, they would go rent it for the weekend. It had other things too, so you'd buy popcorn, drinks, other things there as well. And of course, they also had DVDs on sale as well. Well, the problem with that is that the service they were supplying was just too expensive. All right. To rent $3 for a 2-day rental, $4 was expensive. And though the cost might have been similar, you were also having costs like driving to one location when it's in a given area, you having to wait in line to get the goods that you want. And all of those extra costs stacked up so that the convenience, which is one of the things that you were hoping for, you simply didn't have. And so around 2002, 2003, you saw this company that started providing DVDs from a vending machine. And that's when Redbox came in. And of course, from there, Blockbuster quite simply couldn't compete. They were renting them at the same price that Blockbuster was, but you weren't having to stand in line like you were in a Blockbuster. And invariably, with so many stores across a city, it meant that you could just go to your local drugstore and there would be a Blockbuster where you could rent those items. And so there's actually one Blockbuster left. It's in Oregon, and it's doing well. It's surviving. Most of it's surviving is quite simply is because it's the only one left. So it's kind of interesting. I tried just for the heck of it. I wanted to see if Radio Shacks were still around, and Shacks are still around as well. There's at least five within the driving distance of Boone. There used to be one in the mall, and Radio Shacks had an enormous amount of service supplied for the service demand. Radio Shacks, sadly, their demise happened with cell phone industry. Quite simply, is that they spent so much time on the cell phone part, which was providing them three-quarters of their revenue in the 1990s to 2010s, that they were neglecting the other parts that made Radio Shack great. And of course, once the demand for cell phones shifted to local stores, then they lost their revenue and they went bankrupt. But the interesting thing is that the Radio Shack itself is alive again. Okay, so it's finding a new model and it's finding its way to survive, and it's doing most of it online. So hooray for Radio Shack. And yeah, I'm crazy. I actually bought one of these shirts because I actually used to have a color computer. So anyway, so okay, so cost gaps. Cost gaps, unlike service gaps, only swing in one way. It's only if the cost of performing the functions is too high. There is no such thing as cost being too low. If you can swing it so that you can do all of the channel functions and your price is low, you've won. All right. So cost gaps only go in one direction. It's when the cost of performing them is too high. Service gaps go in both directions, and you can have too much service or you can have too little service depending on the demand. Okay. It is critical and important that you identify the source of where the gap is. So if the gap is on the cost side, the channel cannot reduce or increase its service in its efforts. You've got to be able to perform the same service outputs, but find some way of closing that gap. All right. If the service gap, if you're doing too much of a particular unit, then you may be doing something in an inefficient way. All right. You may have to reduce the level of service if you're doing too much, or you have to find a way of providing the service that they want if you can. The one thing that you want to be able to avoid is you have to be careful that you don't simply cut costs. The danger is providing a solution to the wrong gap. What do I mean? So once again, going back to the record industry, and this is the middle to late 90s. In the middle to late 90s, you had a peaking of demand and sales. As a matter of fact, you started to see a slump in the industry. And one of the reasons why, and the reason that they saw, is that quite simply they were only selling albums, and the albums were $15 to $19. Excuse me, I mean CDs. Here was one of the things that was one of those mistakes that they made about singles. In the industry, it had long been argued that the sale of singles was damaging the sale of albums. So what they thought is that people, if they bought a single, they would not worry about buying an album. Well, actually, when they did enough research, they realized this, is that consumers were buying the singles, and if they liked the single, that spurred them to buy the albums. And so they got it all wrong. So what did the record industry do? They felt like the only thing that they could do is cut the cost of a CD. And it was a disaster because it didn't fix the issue. You know, it didn't fix the fact that people just wanted one song. It didn't crash the industry, but they went through some really bad times because they did not sell any more records than they did, but when they took the price from $15.99 to $11.99, they effectively cut 30 to 40% of their profit margin, and it spelled disaster for quite a long time. So it's important to fix the right gap. So along with this, the cost and service combinations, sometimes because there are links to cost decisions and service outputs that consumers will make that are outside of the issues of gaps. And so the example is, and I just talked about that, was the concept of postponement and speculation. And so with postponement, many times this postponement generally is also goes more towards the consumers, but it does also happen in industry as well. What in postponement, firms and end users will put off incurring costs for as long as they possibly can. So in the manufacturing industry, an example of this is when you are doing just-in-time manufacturing and you'll wait to the very end to buy something so that it shows up exactly when you need it. In consumers, especially now, postponement is really being practiced, especially when it comes to personal entertainment. People, well, for the fact is because movie theaters are shut down, even more so what consumers are doing are waiting until those movies are on their own streaming services so they don't have to incur any additional costs. This has been, everything that I've read in the entertainment industry is it's been there. The streaming services, although I think they're eventual, in terms of their production of entertainment, in some respects, it's been a disaster. Okay. So postponement. Speculation is when you produce goods in anticipation of orders rather than in response to them. And so the example of this is like book publishing, all right? Book publishing is one of those things, especially that in order to incur profits, you have to print tens and thousands of books. And one of the difficulty also is that if speculation is not good enough, you can actually find consumers wanting your goods, being unable to be delivered, and then finding satisfaction in a competitor. Usually, especially this is in the form of electronics, is that consumers will find satisfaction by purchasing something else that will do sufficiently well enough to do what they wish. All right, this, you don't have to worry about this template. It's not going to be on the test. You don't have to know about make or buy channel analysis other than, I'm not even sure I'm going to have a definition on it, but make or buy analysis is when you decide whether or not you wish to make the good yourself versus purchasing it from a third-party provider. And you don't have to worry about that at all. I probably won't have a question on that, okay? So the last part that we're going to talk about is auditing the omni-channels. And we're not going to talk in specifics about that, but in certain generalities about the omni-channels in general and some of the difficulties with it. When you audit the omni-channel, it's very difficult to be able to determine exact gaps because you're using the same number of channel members, but what's happening is you're delivering it into a cohesive, seamless consumer experience. And so what that means is that for your channel members, your wholesalers, or the vendors that you're using, they have to have a lot more conformity to your rules in terms of customer delivering than it would be in a traditional system. The difficulty also with that is with the uniformity is many times it's very difficult to find out, where the gaps are occurring because you demand that consistency among the channels, all right? The one thing, or actually the two things that you're looking for when you're trying to, find out just how successful you are is when you're trying to analyze the distribution depth and breadth. So what does that mean? The depth and the breadth, all right? So the first is the definition of the depth. And the depth could be defined was how much of the overall pie does one product have in a single store, all right? How much of that particular, in that one outlet, how much does that brand dominate? And so let me give you an example. If I'm looking for Samsung TVs and I go into Walmart, okay, and there are 50 televisions that are in Walmart. If Samsung is 25 of those televisions, that would be an example of the breadth. You know, what is the ease of finding it in a particular store? All right. That's the depth. How easy is it finding that brand within a particular channel? And so examples of that, excuse me, is in depth, all right, it is the number of outlets where the brand maintains a store within a store. So if I were to go in a Walmart and there was a whole section that was dedicated to Samsung electronics, that would be an example, all right? Let's say they sell 100 televisions in a day. Depth would be of those 100 televisions, 60 of them are Samsung. Another thing is in terms of the shelf space relative to the competition. If Samsung dominates that section, that would be an example. Also, if I were to do a blind search on the Walmart website and I were to say televisions, if Samsung would be the first 2 pages, that would be an example of depth. If I could buy online or pick up in a store, multiple ways of getting it, support available in the stores itself, that's the depth, how deep it is in each individual location. That's depth. So depth is deep. Excuse me. Sorry. Breadth is wide, okay? And so how many multiple locations can I find this particular brand in a given area? And so if I were to go into Google Maps and I were to type in Samsung televisions and there were 30 locations in Boone, that would be an example of the breadth, the width, you know, how many different locations you can buy that in, okay? And so the breadth metrics is the number of outlets where that brand is available, thousands, okay? The percentage of all the outlets in which the brand is available for purchase, and especially if it's present in the most prominent outlets as well. And then finally, the ease of finding a brand if you were doing general online searches, how many different places that you can find that. They're difficult metrics because there's no perfect way of auditing the omni-channel. But what you're trying to find out with the omni-channel is how much impact the omni-channel has been to that particular item. And that's how you know whether or not it's effective. Auditing the omni-channel is in its infancy. And so it's, how do I say this? It's like trying to measure a planet in another solar system that you can't actually see. You're using measurements that do a reasonable estimation as to whether or not they're providing satisfaction to consumers, okay? And so the last 2 things before I finish, I'm running out of voice, is in terms of tracking the competencies of your brand or your channel partners, probably the 2 in the middle are important. How are the in-store employees credited with online sales? In other words, is the equity principle working here? if an employee in the store is being some kind of support for the work that they do, even in an online sale, that would be important. And then whether or not the pricing and promotions are aligned across the channels, aligned, excuse me. And so if the price is the same from a local retail outlet all the way through the direct channel system, that would be an example as well. All right. The consistency across that shows that there's a strength that the brand brings, and also for the manufacturer that they can impose that consistency of pricing and promotions across all channels. Okay. Okay, and that is the end of chapter 2. And so, as I said before, to be able to familiarize yourself, probably the best kind of strategy is if you have missed one of the classes, I would urge you to take the recordings and work with those. The slides are available to you. Go back to those and mark those. And remember, as I said before, anything that I have not covered will not be on the test, okay? So do I have any questions? Okay, folks, well, look, have a great day. Good luck. Remember, test is Thursday and Friday. If you have any problems with connections or communications, and I understand the real world as it is, so if you have any possibilities or anything going wrong during that, please let me know, okay? Okay, folks, have a great day. Good luck.